Welcome to this 24th lecture in our Quip course in Faith and Life. And in this third term of the first year, we are, of course, looking at church history. And Dimitri Brady today will give this fourth lecture of the term on the Greek-Latin divide. The Greek-Latin divide. Dimitri.
Thank you. Originally, the Christian church in the Roman or Byzantine Empire, as it later became called by historians, had been a pentarchy, organized in 5 patriarchates, namely Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Within the empire, commonly called the Ecumeni, or the universe, certain local churches enjoyed autonomy, for instance Cyprus and Sinai, and others ranked closely with the 5 patriarchates. We think of Carthage and Thessalonica and Aquileia in Italy. A 6th patriarchate at Justiniana, possibly in Kosovo, but the city was destroyed entirely, was briefly added to their number to coordinate missions across the Danube. Among them, Rome had always claimed seniority, and this was accepted by the others, but clearly regarded by them as lacking any practical significance. The ultimate religious authority was in fact increasingly wielded by the Byzantine emperors, who in theory were simply presiding over a holy synod of bishops and were supposed to be impartial. Beyond the empire, beyond the Ecumeni, a series of independent churches came under the authority of one or another Catholicos. These presided over a synod that rarely referred to the pentarchy in the Byzantine or Roman Empire. These latter included the Church of the East, Assyria, Chaldea, and Persia. We would now think of Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, and the churches of Armenia, Iberia or Georgia, Lazica and Abkhazia, and Caucasian Albania, which we would now call Azerbaijan. Elsewhere, metropolitan bishops titled ethnarchs, or national leaders really, came to preside over missionary churches beyond the Black Sea, including Gothia, Zykia, or Circassia, and Alania or Ossetia. Further afield, the churches of Ethiopia, Nubia, and South India also enjoyed varying degrees of independence, largely due to their distance from established Christian centers of authority. Nevertheless, theological differences aside, contacts were maintained and a loose unity was a general aspiration, at least up to the Muslim conquests from 632 onwards. However, when the separation of the Oriental Orthodox was followed by the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch, the pentarchy model around the Mediterranean was severely weakened. Now Rome and Constantinople claimed to speak for all Christians, East and West, and both vied for an ecumenical role. While Constantinople was increasingly tainted by the imperial connection and subjected to the whims, theological and otherwise, of Byzantine emperors, empresses, and courtiers, Rome came to enjoy a greater degree of independence and the correlating status. Thus, Rome's claim that its preeminence implied authority over the entire church became practical politics. Meanwhile, a series of politically astute popes in Rome linked this cause with a campaign against so-called Caesaropapism, meaning by this the imperial direction of religious affairs. We note the promotion in this period from Rome of a number of saints, including Saint Patricia of Naples, who are reputed to have escaped the attentions of emperors, in this case it was the Emperor Justinian, and fled Constantinople to seek sanctuary in Italy, Gaul, or elsewhere in the West. The fall of the Roman Empire in the West had freed the popes of Rome from subordination to an emperor, and it had allowed them to represent the Latin peoples to both Byzantines and barbarians. Barbarians in this period just means people from beyond the confines of the Roman or Byzantine empires. Even during the restoration of imperial power in Italy under Justinian, the bulk of the Roman See, and therefore of papal activity and influence, still lay outside the empire, and this allowed for a greater degree of autonomy. As the distance between the imperial capital in Constantinople and even imperial governors in Ravenna and Rome further reduced the possibility of interference, this autonomy was strengthened. The popes in Rome did not have to follow the twists and turns of Byzantine court policy and diplomacy to nearly the same degree as did the patriarchs and synod of Constantinople and the Greek metropolitans. In consequence, the comparatively unwavering course of the Roman papacy made it appear, even in the East, an impartial arbitrator in disputes and an independent source of rulings on Christian issues. This was at a time when the Patriarchate in Constantinople often functioned as a department of state. At a time when the Greek Church was losing ground to the Oriental Orthodox and then to Islam, Rome gained prestige following the conversion to Christianity of the Visigoths in 589, the Lombards in 653, the Anglo-Saxons in the 7th century, and the varied peoples of Germany and adjoining areas. Furthermore, enjoying the political patronage of the growing Frankish power, based in France from 486 onwards, the papacy was strengthened in an entirely temporal sense. This growth was undermined by the separation of South Italy and regions in the Balkans, which were designated as being within the Patriarchate of Constantinople during the iconoclast controversies. With exceptions like the Vlachs and the Romanians in the East, who were Greek Rite anyway, and the presence of diminishing Greek and Syrian communities in the Western Mediterranean, the West became a solidly Latin Germanic church, and the East was becoming a church not only identified with the Byzantine Empire, but also becoming identified with the Greek peoples, culture and language, and their immediate neighbours and associates. The Byzantines dominated coastal regions of Italy even after the Lombard invasion of 568-572. But the city of Rome now came to be ruled by popes who claimed to act in the name of the emperor in Constantinople. Open rupture with the East came when the Emperor Leo III embraced iconoclasm and issued a series of decrees outlawing the veneration of icons in the Byzantine Empire. This decree was promulgated in 727. The popes in Rome naturally assumed the leadership of the iconophile movement across the Mediterranean, in principled opposition to iconoclast emperors, patriarchs, and synods in Constantinople, and in opposition to the Byzantine military authorities in Italy. At this point, the popes in Rome were recognized by St. Theodore Studitis, amongst others, as the champions of the Orthodox, East and West. Turning to iconoclasm. The origins of the iconoclast movement are thought to be found on the eastern fringes of Anatolia, modern Turkey, towards Armenia and the Caucasus. Not least because most of the iconoclast emperors and the military units that supported them were from the eastern borders of the Byzantine Empire, clearly ethnic Armenians, Isaurians, and possibly Kurds. But also because these regions were home to significant communities for whom the veneration of icons was quite alien. The border provinces contained Armenian and Jacobite Christians, neither interested in icons or supporting the iconophile view, Jews and Muslims, both hostile to images of any description, and the militant Paulicians, an apparently Christian, maybe Manichaean group, highly critical of the veneration of icons, relics, and saints. Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian, took a number of measures against the veneration of icons between 726 and 730. These started with the removal of the revered icon of Christ from the Chalki Gate in Constantinople, and ended with the banning of all icons throughout the Byzantine Empire and its dependencies. He seemed to be responding to a number of events that ranged from Muslim military successes against the Byzantines and the eruption of the volcano on the island of Thera in the Aegean Sea. He failed to convince Patriarch Germanos, who resigned, and he antagonized the popes of Rome, but clearly enjoyed the support of the army and dissenting groups like the Paulicians and others in Armenia and Kurdistan. St. John of Damascus, flourishing between 676 and 749, linked the veneration of icons with the proclamation of the incarnation of the Word of God to express the iconophile or pro-icon position, so dealing with the genuine concerns of sincere Christians who were worried about the increasing prominence of icons in Orthodox worship. At the Council of Hieria in 754, the Emperor Constantine V took these reforms a step further. The invocation of saints was condemned, as was the veneration of relics and icons. Both were burnt or thrown into the sea. Monasteries and their estates were seized by the state, and monks and nuns were expelled, persecuted, or killed. Please remember that we have a category of new martyrs in the Orthodox Church. This eventually came to refer to people, to Christians martyred by the Ottomans and later by the communists in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, but originally it referred to the great numbers of people who were put to death by the iconoclasts. Emperor Leo IV, from 775 to 780, responded to renewed iconophile opposition with further campaigns against monastics and their supporters, at home and abroad. Empress Irene, as regent for her son, Constantine VI, from 780 to 797, reversed all these policies and restored the veneration of icons. This move was supported by the decisions of the celebrated Seventh Ecumenical Council. However, following Bulgarian victories against the Byzantines and a series of natural calamities, Emperor Leo V, the Armenian, from 814, reinstated iconoclasm. At the Synod of the Church of the Holy Wisdom in 815, it was declared that to make or venerate an image of Christ was an Nestorian act, as inevitably only the human Jesus was depicted rather than the Christ, the Word of God. Empress Theodora, wife of the iconoclast Emperor Theophilus, returned to the policies of Irene and the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and the icons were finally restored to Orthodox churches in 843, and this has remained the case. Over this period, a number of distinct iconoclast views and theologies had emerged. Some argued that the appearance of icons in churches was a return to paganism, while others were content that icons should be displayed in churches, but placed high up the walls, beyond the reach of those who would venerate them. St. John of Damascus and St. Theodore the Studite were the main pro-icon or iconophile thinkers who responded to all these challenges. This turbulent period gave rise to growing divisions between East and West. Although with the end of iconoclasm in 843, a formal reconciliation between Constantinople and Rome took place, both West and East were now drifting further and further apart. Differences in outlook, teaching, and worship were increasingly noticed and gave rise to a number of controversies. Bitter polemics hindered a common witness in an age of renewed missionary successes. The first area of conflict was Greater Moravia, corresponding to areas that we would now think of as the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and southern Poland. In Greater Moravia, the original endeavour was Greek, blessed by St. Photios and led by the brothers St. Methodius and St. Kirill from Thessaloniki in the 860s. However, the Latin cause was ascendant, and from 890 onwards, the disciples of St. Methodius and St. Kirill were killed, enslaved, or dispersed, but certainly expelled from Central Europe. At the same time, and we're thinking of 870 for Bulgaria and 879 for Serbia, Montenegro, and areas of the former Yugoslavia, many Slav and neighbouring tribes were converted to Christianity from Constantinople. However, in the same period, Croatia in 879 turned to Rome. Around the year 1000, both churches enlarged further. The Eastern churches were enriched by the admission of the Russians in 988, and here we're referring to historical Rus, which doesn't mean only modern Russia, but Ukraine, Belarus, and elsewhere. The Western churches were enriched by the conversion of the Poles, the Hungarians, and the Scandinavians. In the following decades, both churches continued to expand, major missions being launched from Constantinople to convert the Patzinaks, the Cumans, and the Khazars. The Khazars were originally Jewish, and other Turkic peoples of the northern steppes, the area above the Black Sea. Ominously, the Western Church blessed the reconquest of Spain and military campaigns against the Slavic peoples who were then settled in what we now think of as East Germany. We come to St. Photios, the Patriarch of Constantinople, often referred to in the East as the Great. St. Photios flourished between 810 and 893. He was both a leading theologian and an outstanding intellectual who was at the forefront of a revival in humanism and the classics in Byzantium. Of mixed Armenian and Khazar, maybe Turkic or Mongol descent, he was widely read in the ancient authors, dramatists, and poets, and amassed a vast library in Constantinople. He composed the wonderful Myriobiblos, a literary encyclopedia, possibly while working in Baghdad as ambassador to the Caliph in 845. He also compiled the related lexicon, amongst other works. So a great scholar of what we would now call Renaissance sort of stature. St. Photios was consecrated Patriarch of Constantinople twice, between 853 and 867, and again between 877 and 886. On both occasions replacing the deposed St. Ignatius. Highly critical of Latin customs, he was opposed by Pope Nicholas I of Rome, who declared him deposed in 863, even though his position as patriarch had previously been recognized by Rome in 861. By 865, St. Photius was engaged in polemics with Rome regarding opposing missions in Greater Bulgaria, what we would now think of as Bulgaria and Romania. Here, Tsar Boris I had embraced Christianity, but unsurprisingly, he was puzzled by the different approaches of the established Greek mission and newly arrived missionaries from Rome. Having supported the Greek mission to Greater Moravia, it would appear that St. Photius encouraged the disciples of St. Methodius and St. Kirill to seek refuge in Bulgaria before 886, so redirecting their energies and founding an autocephalous Slavonic church. The Bulgarians, or the Proto-Bulgarians in this period, were not Slavs, but they were already identifying with the Slavic populations around them. Having been excommunicated in Rome, St. Photius anathematized the Pope in 865. On theological grounds, he wrote against the inclusion of the Filioque in the Creed and the Latin position on the double procession of the Holy Spirit. A reconciliation was secured in 879, but Latin pressure and Venetian interest secured both persecution and the eventual exile of St. Photius to a remote monastery in Armenia in 886. His legacy to the Orthodox Christian world, to the Byzantine Commonwealth, remains, not least in a series of Orthodox churches, from the Gagauz Orthodox Church on the borders of Moldova and Ukraine to the flowering of Slavonic Christianity in Bulgaria, Serbia, Russia, and neighboring regions. Quite to the east of what's indicated there. The Great Schism of 1054, the Latin persecution of Greek missionaries in Central Europe, think of the case of Greater Moravia, and the undermining of long-established Greek missions in the territories under Bulgarian rule, soured relations between East and West. Where the two churches collided, contacts became increasingly bitter, not least in Croatia, which had originally leaned towards Constantinople, and Albania, which still in this period is linked to Constantinople. The writings of St. Photius underline Greek unease with certain innovations, so-called innovations, taken up in the West. Certainly the Filioque and divergent customs relating to fasting and kneeling, etc. On the Latin side, the Greeks had come under attack for heresy, ever since King Charlemagne had established the Holy Roman Empire, or Frankish rule, in France, Germany, Austria, and North Italy in 800. Divisions widened when the Normans, well known in Britain, received the papal blessing to drive the Greeks out of South Italy between 1017 and 1071. And please remember that the Norman Crusade lumped together the Greeks and the Arabs. The Greeks and the Arabs were to be driven out of southern Italy and Sicily. The Normans forcibly reunited the Church of South Italy and Sicily to Rome. They expelled most Greek bishops. In a series of violent campaigns, they proceeded to establish warring enclaves in Anatolia. They sacked Thessaloniki in Greece, and they invaded Albania in 1080. Their presence in Albania leads to the division of the church in Albania to the present day. Even Antioch in Syria was attacked by the Normans. Unsurprisingly, from the perspective of the Byzantines, if you're sitting in Constantinople, it looked as if the entire Western Church endorsed this aggression and sought to subjugate, marginalize, or extinguish the Eastern churches. The stage was perfectly set for the Great Schism of 1054. This followed a series of misunderstandings. A Latin bishop based in Norman-held territory John of Trani had been in correspondence with Greek theologians. When they received the support of Patriarch Michael in criticising the use of unleavened bread and calling the Latins Azymites and other Latin customs, and in affirming the ancient Pentarchy, and that the 28th clause of the Council of Chalcedon from 451 declared Rome and Constantinople to be equal, a diplomatic incident was inevitable. If only this correspondence hadn't occurred. Papal legates sent to Constantinople excommunicated the Patriarch and his supporters, adding insult to injury by placing the bull of excommunication on the very altar of the Church of Holy Wisdom. Today we understand that this move was not necessarily endorsed by the Pope, but very little was done to unravel this mess, to sort it out. Inevitably, Patriarch Michael reciprocated with an anathema, but even so, the mutual excommunications at this point were only perceived as being against individuals rather than entire communions. The Eastern Church and the Western churches did not view all their corresponding number to have fallen into heresy. Normans and Crusaders, and there's an intrinsic link. Originally from Scandinavia, the Normans dominated northern France and later England after 1066. Throughout this period, Norman campaigns in the east were characterized by excessive violence and atrocities, and were often followed by raids launched from Venice, previously a Byzantine ally and dependency in Italy. The perception developed that this was an all-out assault on the Orthodox Christian East rather than the acts of random adventurers. This idea was reinforced as the monastic republics of Mount Athos, Olympus, Latros, and the Black Mountain in Syria were repeatedly targeted by Norman raiders. Following the campaigns of the Crusaders, thinking now of 1095 onwards, prejudices continued to multiply on both sides. The Crusaders typically failed to distinguish Eastern Christians from Muslims and Jews in military campaigns and punitive measures. The slaughter of the citizens of Antioch and Jerusalem are the best known cases where this occurred. Wherever the Crusaders prevailed, the Orthodox clergy were expelled, monasteries and churches were seized by the Western monastic orders or simply sacked. And very galling for the sensibility of the era, relics, icons, ecclesiastical treasures were removed generally on the spot to the west. The Crusaders claimed that the Byzantines were double-dealing as they sheltered Muslims. The Crusaders noted that there were mosques in Constantinople and synagogues, and indeed in many other cities. And they were incensed when the Byzantines made treaties with the Kurdish Saladin and other Muslim leaders. In 1182, intercommunal violence in Constantinople resulted in the massacre of the Latin population of the city, and the violence spread. Some have argued that this led directly to the excesses of the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Remember that Doge Dandolo of Venice, who advised the Crusaders on this occasion, had previously been blinded in the pogroms against the Latins in 1182. Not only was Constantinople thoroughly looted, but the Orthodox churches were deliberately desecrated, really to add insult to injury, as we've said earlier. Icons and relics were all sent to the West alongside with other treasures. Libraries were burnt, important monuments were destroyed, and what remained was vandalized. Don't forget that the court in Constantinople had amassed what we would now think of as a museum of the great artworks of the pagan and classical world. These were all apparently destroyed in the sack. Frankish rule was inaugurated throughout the former Byzantine territories. Greece was renamed New France. This really indicates how determined the Crusaders were to make a new start. And the Crusaders went on to attack Bulgaria and Serbia. The expulsion of the Orthodox clergy and the promotion of Uniatism and forced union of the churches on Latin terms, where this proved difficult, continued beyond the arrival of the Ottoman Turks from 1453 and cemented the lasting division of East and West. None of these incidents are forgotten in the East. The West maybe didn't note a lot of what was going on, but this provides the background to popular and church antipathy to the West. So we come to St. Mark Evgenikos, who died in 1444. And the real sort of entrenchment of the Byzantine position against the West. In the last decade of the Byzantine Empire, the relation between the Eastern and Western churches had deteriorated to such a degree that Notaras, the first minister of Byzantium, could publicly declare that it was preferable to see the Muslim Turks holding Constantinople rather than the Christian Latins. I'm afraid he doesn't refer to the Latins as Christians. Although a number of attempts had been made to reunite the churches, these had been terribly one-sided, entirely favouring the position of the papacy, and were unpopular amongst both Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox Christians in the Mediterranean. St. Mark Evgenikos was an intellectual. He was consecrated Metropolitan of Ephesus solely to represent the traditional Orthodox view at the Council of Florence. He expressed clear opposition to the Latin-minded, the so-called Latinophones, and those arguing for Christian unity against the Turks, regardless of principles compromised or sacrificed. Unlike St. Photios, he held that the Latins had actually fallen into heresy and were condemning themselves. The addition of the Filioque, the primacy of the See of Rome, the teachings relating to purgatory and limbo, the idea of the definite damnation of non-Christians, and the urgency of infant baptism and the system of indulgences were all points that he saw and his school saw as being evidence of heresy. At the Council of Florence, he was the only representative holding out against false union, dictated by political expedience. Much as this was necessitated by the military successes of the Ottoman Turks across Eastern Europe. However, he expressed the views of most Orthodox Christians of his time and for many centuries to come. Interestingly, he won the support of both the pro-Union scholar Gennadios, the first patriarch under the Ottoman Turks in 1453, and the last pagan philosopher, Gemistos Plithon. St. Mark Evgenikos was courageous in refuting the Roman Catholic scholars and Uniates, even the Greek cardinals Bessarion and Isidore of Kiev. He braved the wrath of Pope Eugene IV in Italy and the imperial court at home. Expelled from Ephesus by the Turks, he was later imprisoned on the island of Lemnos and died confined in the Mangana monastery in Constantinople. We shall now survey two dualistic heresies in the East developing across this whole period before assessing the legacy of the Greek-Latin divide. In the background we have the Paulicians and the Bogomils. The Paulicians appeared on the Byzantine-Armenian borders around 657, following a preacher called Constantine of Mananalis, who was later executed. A Byzantine general, Simeon, sent to drive them out of their mountain castles actually converted to their cause in 690. Communities were established across Asia Minor, and an independent state was centered on Tifriki, on the border between Byzantium and the Arabs. From here they campaigned successfully across the east and had sacked Ephesus in 871. Later Byzantine emperors, like John Tzimiskis, campaigned against the Paulicians and resettled many communities in the Balkan provinces and regions adjacent to Byzantium. The Paulicians have been called early Protestants, but they were a Christian movement deeply influenced by Manichaeism. They distinguished between the God of the material world and the God of souls, and taught that Christ was a supreme angel sent to the world by his real mother, the heavenly Jerusalem. They rejected the Old Testament and had an aversion for icons, relics, and monks. The Paulicians were led by apostles and prophets and believed that the true baptism and Eucharist were hearing the word of God. The last Paulician communities in Bulgaria were reconciled to the Roman Catholic Church, such was their antipathy to the Orthodox Church, in 1650. They were still active in Armenia in 1837, teaching from a sacred book called the Key of Truth. They had first been condemned in Armenia at a synod in 719. Moving on, apparently founded by one Bogomil, the name means dear to God, the Bogomils emerged in Bulgaria in the decades 927 to 970. Contemporary writers claim that they were linked to the Syrian Massalians and the Greek Euchite heresies, but it is now thought that this was originally a homegrown church reform movement that came under the influence of Paulicians and Manichaeans. The imperfect conversion of Bulgaria, the unpopularity of Greek clergy, and tensions between the ruled Slavs and the Bulgarian rulers probably contributed to their early success and popularity. The Bogomils taught that Christ was the Son of God by adoption, and that in fact he was the Archangel Michael. His elder brother was the rebellious Satanael, who was equally opposed to the good Archangel Uriel. Bogomils established communities led by 12 apostles and encouraged women to exercise leadership. They vehemently rejected the Eucharist, icons, monks, and the entire Orthodox Church and its paraphernalia. The Bogomils were active in Russia as late as the 14th century, certainly in Novgorod. They established an independent state in Bosnia, where they were also called Patarines. The Bogomils are the link between the Paulicians and earlier groups and the later Cathars and Albigenses of Provence and southern France. A city was founded in Bulgaria to protect Bogomils who had returned to the Orthodox Church. This was called Alexiopolis and was sited near to Plovdiv or Philippopolis in South Bulgaria. So all of that is going on in the background as we see the Greek and Latin churches drifting apart. The estrangement of the Greek and Latin traditions of the Church over a number of centuries before and after the Great Schism of 1054 in part had its roots not only in the emergence of a reinvigorated papacy and in the Carolingian Renaissance which had promoted it, but also in the increasingly divergent theological emphasis of West and East. The West sought a cultural expression of Christianity which would reinforce the increasingly feudal hierarchy of the Normans and the Franks, themselves the primary champions of a reformed and strengthened papacy. In this regard, law and deference to due authority came to triumph over ascetical transformation. In the East, distrust of the Latins was compounded by the Crusades and a gradual isolation between two approaches to Christianity which had sat alongside each other more harmoniously in earlier centuries. The religious and political ascendancy of the West had begun. Christians in the East became increasingly harried by invaders from further east and the south. It would be some time before the newly converted southern Slavs would contribute to an Orthodox Christian Russia to be reckoned with on the world stage.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you.